everybody, and welcome to WellSpouse Association presents Exploring Care, Transformations That Matter with Dr. Zachary White and Donna Thompson. So with that, let me present Dr. Zachary White and Donna Thompson.
Thank you, Jerry. This is Zachary speaking, and Donna and I are so grateful to be here this evening with all of you. I want to make sure that we thank WellSpouse for making this possible, for making this webinar accessible to the WellSpouse organization, an organization that Donna and I find of extreme value, and has been very kind to me as a member of the honorary board for the WellSpouse organization. If you are unfamiliar with the WellSpouse organization, I encourage you after the webinar tonight to check out their website and the resources they have available to you. We're going to have an opportunity to spend about an hour together, and Donna and I will go through, talk with you about our research experience and book that we think is of value to you as a caregiver, wherever you are in the spectrum of care, whether you are just beginning or you are deeply embedded in the care experience. And it is an honor and privilege for us to speak with you tonight, in large part because there are very few opportunities in American life for us to gather around topics such as caregiving, where we are all impacted in different ways, but there are commonalities that Donna and I hope to share with you tonight. And whenever we speak, Donna and I always emphasize that you are the expert. So we are not speaking to you tonight as the experts on your care situation. In fact, you are the ultimate expert on where you are in your care situation, who you're caring for, the particular nature, disease, condition of your care situation, your family situation, your financial situation. All of these things, of course, impact how you care, how you conceive and interpret the care experience. But what Donna and I hope to do tonight is to give you some insight, perhaps, about your experiences that you might be able to use in your own way and in ways that make sense to you. My name is Dr. Zachary White. I am a professor of communication at Queen's University of Charlotte in North Carolina. And since 2002, I have been examining the caregiver experience from a variety of perspectives. It started with my own family situation with my mother and a terminal diagnosis after acute care experiences. And I was fascinated by the care experience at that time. I was getting my PhD in communication and was taken aback by all that I had been learning had so inadequately prepared me for the situation I was faced before me. And from that point forward, I have been researching communication theories and approaches and perspectives to better understand the experience. In particular, the care experiences that I have explored and researched with countless interviews have spanned from the neonatal and intensive care unit with parents to the chronic caregiver experience, spousal caregiver experience, as well as end-of-life caregiving experiences. And tonight, Donna and I are going to talk about the book that we have out called The Unexpected Journey of Caring, The Transformation from Loved One to Caregiver. And I am honored to be joined by Donna Thompson, who is the author of The Four Walls of My Freedom, her first book, as well as the lead author on this book that we're looking at here, The Unexpected Journey of Caring, The Transformation from Loved One to Caregiver. And Donna's website is also an incredible resource, The Caregiver's Living Room. She has been an inspiration to me, a research partner, and an international caregiver activist as she is housed in Canada. And Donna, you want to introduce yourself and speak to your wonderful family here?
It's my pleasure to do that. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Zachary. And just as you've said, we are fantastic writing partners and friends, and both caregiving activists and just passionate, I think, passionate supporters of caregivers everywhere. So this is my family. I'd like to introduce you. My husband, Jim, our daughter, Natalie, and this is our son, Nicholas, who is 30 years old now. He has severe cerebral palsy, and he's medically complex. and now lives outside of our home and requires 24-hour one-to-one nursing care. But that level of care we provided to him ourselves for 23 years in a home ICU setting. I also helped to care for my mom, who passed away last summer at the age of 96. So I've been a caregiver, really all of my adult life, and I've had an opportunity to reflect deeply on the meaning of my own caregiving and how other caregivers might experience similar journeys, but also in the knowledge that every caregiving experience is very unique and, as Zachary said, impacted by a multitude of factors. So we always learn from each other, and we do know that there is an immense amount of support within the caregiving community that we can offer to one another. So we're going to be talking about some of those ideas tonight.
Great. So the format we'll have tonight is we'll kind of present some ideas informed by our book and our experiences. Of course, we can't go into the kinds of detail that we might have in our book, but we really wanted to focus on what we think is most relevant. One aspect of the transformation that impacts many of you tonight as spousal caregivers or caregivers across the spectrum, and that is this transformation from loved one to caregiver. It is unlike any other relationship, isn't it? And yet we very rarely talk about this transformation culturally. We very rarely think about this relationship and how it transforms us and our loved one and what we expect and what we can think about in terms of our expected realities as a couple. And you think about the various roles and relationships in life, and almost inevitably, we think about friendship relationships, we think about romantic relationships, we think about spousal relationships, we think about grandparent relationships, but we rarely, if ever, talk about what it means to be a caregiver. Because none of us here tonight walked into our particular relationship, perhaps, as a sole caregiver for our loved one. Behind every caregiver label is the pre-existing relationship of love and of care that really situated you distinct from anyone else. And so Donna and I often talk about the fact that no one can really claim alone that they are a caregiver exclusively, especially in this informal setting that you are experiencing care. You are also a spouse or any other relationship you might be sharing with the person you're caring for. So this is a radical transformation that oftentimes goes unnoticed by other people. For example, in your own relationships with your spouse, friends and family might think that your relationship is similar but different than others, but enough similar to their own spousal relationship that you have some sense of commonality, and there's not a whole lot of drastic difference to your experiences other than what they see. But you know differently. You know that everything about your relationship is transformed, and all the beliefs and attitudes and expectations and ways of interacting, ways of disclosing, ways of talking about and thinking about your relationship with your loved one is different than you anticipated it to be, perhaps, different than you wanted it to be, different than you hoped it would be. And so we're going to talk about this. This is the backdrop that we'll go through all of our discussion tonight, specifically for spousal caregivers. I apologize for the bright nature of this slide, but I think it does highlight this disorientation. What we talk a lot about in our book is the idea that in this transition or transformation from loved one to caregiver, there is a radical disorientation that oftentimes happens beyond the purview of other people noticing, other people being able to appreciate, or let's be honest, beyond our ability to explain in ways that are meaningful and relevant to us what is happening to us in this transformation from loved one to caregiver. And we like this slide in part because it's messy. There is no beginning or ending to it. Donna and I talk often about the fact that there is no true beginning to a caregiver relationship. Maybe you were in a relationship with your spouse long after you recognized or acknowledged that you in fact were a caregiver. And while there is at times a moment of recognition that you are the caregiver, you alone are responsible for your loved one's well-being. In other words, if not you, then who else? You might have recognized this title, but others don't recognize you as such, or the label itself seems constrictive and not necessarily you want what you want because it interferes with your ability to see yourself as a spouse. It changes the way you see your loved one, more so as a nurse at times rather than in an intimate fashion that might characterize your caregiver, your spousal relationship. So the beginning and the ending of this slide is messy. It's bright, it's difficult to look at, it's disorienting, similar to that of kind of like a vertigo situation where you may be experiencing vertigo and the world around you looks very different. It looks and is turned upside down and your sense of balance is off. While everyone about you doesn't see or know what you are experiencing, but you yourself know something that others don't and have a hard time expressing. And it is some of these questions that we've come up with that we know that caregivers go through at various times, not simply at the beginning of their caregiver relationship, but throughout the experience that are more or less pronounced at different times. You know, if you've asked yourself, you know, why do I feel so alone, even when you're surrounded by your loved one or by family and friends, or why is it that the more time and energy and attention I provide to my loved one in need, the less comfortable I feel interacting with close family and friends? See, caregiving impacts not just simply what happens to you and your loved one, and you know that more intimately than anyone else. It also shapes how you look at your friends, how you experience your family, what you value, and how other people understand you. If you have found yourself asking yourself why you feel so frustrated and out of place in the company of people you used to enjoy, either in the workplace or at home or in family settings, then tonight we're going to try to unpack one very specific type of transformation. And in the book, we talk about a total of 5 transformations, but this is one transformation that caregivers oftentimes experience in the solitude of their own minds. And
Zachary,
it is this transformation. Yes.
Oh,
Donna,
sorry.
go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that I had a conversation with another caregiver this week, and we were talking about this idea of disorientation and how private it is. It's profound and it's earth-shaking in its effect on everything you thought was true, everything you felt was anchoring you in your life has suddenly become unmoored. And this caregiver, as we began to explore this idea of disorientation, she said to me, you know, it's like no one has ever talked about this before. This is a conversation that has been so private, so internal, that this is like this conversation, you are beginning to provoke a conversation on this topic for the very, very first time. And I think that that simply reflects the deep private nature of this and how difficult it is to put language to it. It's really hard to talk about.
That's such a great point, Donna. The idea that much of a caregiver's reality is privatized, and the conversations occur within one's own mind. And as we talk about often, there's a real price to pay when that happens, because something becomes real when it is named, and a particular reality becomes created when it is shared. Similar to what we're doing tonight, in an effort to help others who are present here have a common way of talking about their experiences, and that explains why they might feel, respond, or react in ways that are not necessarily idiosyncratic as much as they are about this caregiver role and relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does transform your relationship with your family and friends. And oftentimes when we talk about support, right, Donna, we talk about, well, people around you are important. Having support is essential. We know that it's essential to your resilience, but we know that that caregivers, the people joining us tonight, us, oftentimes it's not just having people around you, it's how you think about your family and friends. And one preliminary step of this private experience you're talking about, Donna, is about the transformation of how you think about your experiences and how you think about the people around you, the support system, your family and friends that you believed at one point pre-caregiving, and that would be with you throughout. I mean, that's what we believe and hold to be true because they are family and friends. There is also something that happens that it kind of takes us off our game at times and makes us question things, because caregiving initiates this intolerance, not for people. So oftentimes we say, I don't like this particular family member, or my friends have disappointed me, and that may be true. And you will inevitably have already gone through that experience or in the midst of it. But we want to talk a little bit about tonight is an intolerance for other people's habits and expectations and taken for granted assumptions, because whether you acknowledge it or not, this private disorientation that Donna was talking about is shaping newfound beliefs and attitudes that make you intolerant of being in the company of people whose values and attitudes don't reflect your reality anymore. And so Donna and I are going to kind of walk through some of these, what we call intolerances, not for people, but for ways of thinking and acting that may make sense to other people, but don't make sense to you given your caregiver realities. So let's talk about this idea of intolerance for other people's belief in patience. Now, we're all for patience, right? Patience is a virtue, right? But think about what we're talking about here. Think about how people around you at work or in your family or even in your own home or on television are talking about their experiences. Now, does this make sense? When you hear people talking that, oh, I'll just wait until tomorrow to do something or to act on something. Or, yeah, next month, that's when I'll start doing what I really want to do. This may not have bothered you pre-caregiving identity, pre-caregiving experiences, but if you've heard this recently, it might rankle you in ways that makes you uncomfortable, and we call this a type of intolerance with other people's patience for not taking advantage of their experiences. Donna, have you heard someone recently say that they were really bored with their life, or there's no rush to talk about something? Have you heard that recently?
Yeah, we're bombarded with these messages on television and on social media. It's people are simultaneously bored and in a hurry. It's very frustrating when you're living day to day in meeting someone's needs, and sometimes in life and death situations. That sort of boredom, the idea that people have all the time in the world to do whatever they want to do is intolerable.
Yeah, and it's if we separate it from the person, we can see it differently. That we are all shaped by values and beliefs that work for us. And for people who are not in caregiving situations, this kind of today doesn't really matter because I can count on tomorrow might work. But for caregivers, I want us to think about this emerging caregiver reality of impatience, not impatience with people, but impatience with the value of patience as a way of living. Because this is what makes us feel deeply alone when we overhear these conversations. When you are close to struggle, a loved one struggle for life, a loved one struggle for breath, a loved one struggle for movement, there's an urgency to life. There's a sense that you are experiencing life differently than people who believe that today is just another day. Because you as a caregiver are this linchpin maybe for your spouse that is the difference between life and death, or breath or no breath, or comfort or discomfort. And those kinds of daily caregiver responsibilities reflect a radically different reality than what friends and family might experience. And so Donna gets at this idea, this imperative of now, this appreciation of now, this need to experience now differently than others do. In your own caregiving experiences, Donna, this idea that every moment must matter because you recognize the preciousness and fragility of the moment.
Yes.
What we
It's
talk about
funny.
with caregivers is, go ahead, Donna.
Well, I was just going to, I was just recalling as you were saying that, Zachary, um, a moment that I had a few months ago, and our son was very ill, and he was going into surgery, and I he was sedated on a respirator, and I laid my body on his, just resting my arms and as much of myself on him so that he could feel my heart and I could feel his. And I told him that my all of my love and all of my energy was going into his body to help him be strong for the surgery. We were worried that he wouldn't survive that surgery. He did, but that moment of blending our two selves together was a perfect image in my mind of being together and being almost one. It's no coincidence that over time we begin to refer to ourselves and our loved one as we. We were in the
Yes.
hospital. We were ill. We had a crisis. We've been fine lately, much better. It, I becomes we, and just that moment kind of in my own personal experience of caregiving just reminded me of that imperative of now and how that plays out um, physically, emotionally, and how that impacts on our daily values that inform the decisions we make on a moment-to-moment basis.
That's such a poignant example. And in that example alone with your son, the idea that in that course of an hour for a caregiver, you can experience joy and grief and happiness and sadness. And yet when someone asks you, how was your day? You almost trip up because to those who are not moved or impacted by the caregiver experience, they have good days and bad days. They have either ors. Caregivers tend to have this urgency of experience the full spectrum of emotions in the course of an hour, let alone a day.
Yeah.
Another intolerance that caregivers have in this transformation is a growing intolerance for others' belief in certainty. Well, others might be able to believe that life is controllable, right? Predictability is expected. And so tomorrow will just work itself out because you know what? I mean, yesterday was like today and tomorrow will be just like today. So there's this assumption of continuity in the minds and hearts and values of those who are not caregivers. And it's a really fascinating because we don't hear or see caregivers experience reality this way, because when you are surrounded by, impacted by, hear the sounds of breathing and life of your loved one and all that goes with that, there's no way that one can believe in certainty of expectation and predictability that is so valued by so many other people who, for some reason, whose lives and bodies at this point don't require them to rethink this idea of predictability. And so it highlights itself in very simple kinds of experiences, right, Donna? I mean, in terms of like when the phone rings and you're a caregiver, when you're not a caregiver, you anticipate an opportunity, right? Like, oh, someone's calling. This is great. When you get an email, it's a work challenge. This is an opportunity, perhaps, or an incoming text. It's an opportunity to connect with a friend. But that certainty in that others experience is very different than the emerging caregiver reality that we know defines the caregiver experience of this hyper vigilance about so much of our experiences. And, it's an appreciation of the idea that there's a deep appreciation of what can go wrong, what might go wrong, because when you respond to uncertainty as a caregiver, you must account for all the various things that could happen. When we talk and overhear our friends and family and work colleagues they don't think this way. They don't think about all the probabilities and possibilities. But when you're a caregiver, there's something about your experiences that recognizes that continuity doesn't exist, predictability is a myth, and one must be hypervigilant to recognize that yesterday may have been a different world that you lived in, and tomorrow won't work itself out necessarily, and tomorrow or this hour from the next hour, it might be radically different. So it's not like caregivers, we're not saying that caregivers are more negative. We're saying that there's a hypervigilant awareness that is particular to the orientation of a caregiver that is a response to uncertainty of this role. Do you find yourself experiencing this too, Donna, in terms of this hypervigilant caregiver reality?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, for a long time, I had PTSD with respect to the phone ringing. I still have a little bit of it. When the phone rings, uh, I have a gut instinct that it's bad news about someone I love if they're not right beside me. So I only really feel more relaxed if I am with the people I love who are vulnerable and who need care. If they're not in the at home with me and the phone rings, I automatically think it's bad news and I have a heart-stopping moment. But I also wanted to mention here, Zachary, that I think this idea of hypervigilance, of intolerance of this belief in control, the fallacy of control, has to do also with the idea that we talk about a lot of caregiver guilt. So we begin to think, because there are so many messages in society at large that tell us that if our will and our love is strong enough, we can control outcomes. We should be able to control outcomes. We should be able to overcome the effects of aging, of disease, of whatever it is that afflicts the person who needs our care. And the idea that we have to accept the forces of nature, and we have to become more or less okay with uncertainty, living in the moment, at the same time being hypervigilant for meeting the needs of someone who may be very vulnerable without our care. These are competing forces, and I think sometimes the result is what we tend to call in society today caregiver guilt.
Such a great point. And that guilt is also a byproduct of the fact that it's difficult to buy into other people's perceptions of control, and then also live in a world that, in a caregiver reality, that tells you something very different. And so it's such a great point about hypervigilance and connection to PTSD, in the sense of, a phone rings, like you said, and you might anticipate bad news, or an incoming text from even a friend or family member might be just another example of emotional exhaustion. Like, I have to respond to my family member via text in a way that is different than how I really want to respond to that person. So these are so interrelated, as you're talking about, Donna. Another intolerance that we often find to experience as caregivers is other people's absolute belief in independence. This idea that my life is my life, and I'm not going to let anyone get in the way of what I want to achieve or accomplish. So it's not surprising, like, if you think about, whenever people talk about dreams or aspirations or goals, there's always that assumptive verb of subject of I, and the I is always acting alone and apart from the context of relationships that so define our existence. I will do this, I want this, I need this. These are things that are important, but they don't really make a whole lot of sense to caregivers whose reality is very different and grounded in a relational reality that is unlike this idea that our lives are compartmentalized and can be compartmentalized and should be compartmentalized, that my home life is different from my romantic life, which is different from my friend life, right? Spousal caregivers, we know that is not true. That can't be true. It is one of the most challenging things that you might be experiencing, is that this blurring of experiences, that there are no independent parts of our lives that we can go to anymore. Caregiving follows us. It doesn't stay in one space. We don't dress for work and forget our home life. It is with us all the time. And one thing that spousal caregivers face that most others don't and can't or choose not to fully understand is that it's difficult to be tolerant for other people who believe that all relationships are choice-based. And we talked about the fact that caregivers always emanates from a pre-existing relationship of love and care. And we're going to break down this idea of choice, right? I mean, yes, there's choice and there's not choice. There's an ongoing tension throughout this caregiver experience, but it doesn't make sense when it's framed through this lens of independence, because the reality that caregivers experience is one of radical interdependence, not independence, right? Who you are becoming and who you are cannot be separated from the person you care for. You know, it's not your life alone, it's our life. It's not I will, it's we will. Not I want, it's we want. And not we need, but I need. Not I need, but we need. Do you want to highlight something there about this? What it means to be in a caregiving situation, John, or were your realities of interdependence that most others do not understand?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because when we think about interdependence, that it also leads us to remember that caregiving relationships are reciprocal. And, you know, in caring for my mother, for example, my mother at the end of her long life had a lot of care needs, and I would go and I would move things around in her room and fix meals and you know, maybe put lotion on her legs or whatever it was that she needed. And she needed a lot of things done. And then she'd say to me, now you sit down, I'm going to rub your shoulders. And now she said, and she would call me Little Donna. Now, Little Donna, tell me what you're doing these days, and maybe I can help. I could give you money. You know, she wanted to be my mom still.
Right.
And we still had this sense of interdependence. And that was difficult to explain to other people. When I was talking about my mom, I would tell about her age or her health circumstances or whatever. And, you know, people who didn't understand the realities of my relationship with my mother would make all kinds of assumptions about that this is all one way, and well, you really better say no to a lot of this stuff you're doing, and you just need a break, you need respite, and all of these other assumptions that, you know, my real life was apart from the people I love, which couldn't have been further from the truth. It was difficult to explain because people, I don't think, necessarily want to understand this idea of interdependence because it runs counter to their personal values and their beliefs about independence.
You're right, and it becomes a type of threat, in particular for spousal caregivers, where when people reflect on their own partnerships or marriages, it frightens people to think that what is happening to someone else could happen to them. And interdependence is a scary concept for people, and so you as a caregiver are oftentimes stigmatized and then alienated because, well, I don't want to spend time around someone who might remind me that my own experiences and life dreams might be relationally grounded in ways that I didn't anticipate nor perhaps want. And so you become a threat to their experiences. And so you and I oftentimes use this word, Donna, this idea of trespassing on caregiving doesn't respect any boundaries. It cannot be quarantined. It cannot be put in a box. It can't be something you try on in the morning and you take off at night. And that's why the label itself is so challenging. But it trespasses on all parts of our lives, and how even when we don't want it to be somewhere, even when we don't want to be interdependent, we can't help but recognize that our sense of self and our identity are in so many different ways. And so more so than others, spousal caregivers can oftentimes recognize in deeply felt ways the paradoxes of relationship choice. I mean, think about how other people talk about their relationship choices, and then think about how you think about your relationship. It's complicated, it's complex, it's tension-filled. Yes, you chose to be in a relationship. It's also a non-choice because caregivers know that if they don't do this, then they believe that no one else will. And love and care mixed together. I think this is a remarkably complicated formula that is often defined by asymmetry. You know, you are providing more in the relationship than the other might be able to provide, and that changes how you think about your spouse. It changes how they think about themselves if they're capable cognitively of doing so, and so it makes it remarkably complicated. You want to add anything to that choice and non-choice component, Donna, that's so relevant to spousal caregivers?
I think you've wrapped it up beautifully. I don't have anything to add.
And then just as we're moving along here, this idea that intolerance for other people's belief in change, and Donna, you were talking about this, you were alluding to this a few minutes ago. You know, it's hard to be around people who are always talking about doing an action in ways that it draws crowds, attention, and applause. This idea that with hard work I can fix anything. And while we all might believe this, it does defy our everyday realities as caregivers. When I really want something, I can make it happen. You know, people who might tell you from afar, well, there's always a solution. You know, mentioning the example you were talking about, Donna, being able to say no to something. It's this idea from afar that that if you really want something, you can find a workaround. This is a care with conditions. And so people from afar, family and friends who are well-intentioned and sincere, they care, but there are conditions to their care. And the condition oftentimes is that if I can't fix something, if I can't make something better, then I don't feel comfortable being around it. And there's nothing that caregivers feel more than that reality, that their care is always conditional. But your care, to be a spousal caregiver, at some point you must accept the realities that are faced before us by our loved ones, and they oftentimes contradict or defy completely our deepest desires and wants for something to be better, for improvement, for recovery. But we know that what we want and desire is not always possible, and we must accept that reality at times in order to provide the types of comfort that is required of our situation. You know, making something happen that someone else might say or believe of value from outsiders. For caregivers, spousal caregivers, it might be about creating connection, solving problems. We work from the premise of being with another in light of what exists. So while others might care with conditions, we must care with acceptance to the extent that we may not like what's before us. We may not have chosen what's before us. We may not want what is before us, but in order to care, there is a certain level of acceptance that must be had. Whereas from the outside world, they oftentimes call that settling or a different kind of reality. But they might say, well, you're more compassionate than I am. You're just more fit for this role than I am. And it's a very different reality that we face. Do you want to add anything about this idea of acceptance, Donna, and this caregiver reality of, despite what we want, to care, we must walk toward our loved one while others are walking away?
Yeah, that's so well put. And, you know, when people talk about wisdom, people talk about wise elders, you know, it's ironic to me that there are so many kind of retreats that people go on to get some kind of advanced knowledge about the meaning of life. Caregivers can tell you the meaning of life because they walk, as you said, Zachary, with someone who is suffering, and they do not turn away from it. This teaches us and reminds us constantly of our own mortality, our own vulnerability. But this vulnerability, being in the presence of um, someone who is suffering or has a disease or is aging, this vulnerability becomes almost an asset because it enables us to be deeply human together. And this experience of great and profound intimacy is life-changing, and I think life-affirming. And it really does give us, I think, knowledge of what it is to be human that other people are sort of struggling through life without, when they turn away from vulnerability, from loving relationships of someone who needs your comfort. This is a loss in their life, I think. I'm just going to put that out as a a bit of a bold statement, but I think it is.
Absolutely, and which reinforces the idea that we must find value in the care experiences that we are in the midst of. But it's so challenging because oftentimes we feel like there's an audience. There is not an audience for our experiences, and that's why we're so grateful that people are joining together tonight, and organizations like WellSpouse. And I want to move through a little quicker some of these slides that you'll be able to access these at a later date in terms of some of the challenges of communicating or sometimes our intolerances are for people who are closest to us in terms of our family and friends, because their assumptions reflect different values that we are learning and leaning on as caregivers. And I want to make sure there's some actionable ideas and steps tonight, and you can go through at a later date and kind of think through some of these questions that we posed. But Donna, do you want to talk through the advantages of kind of care mapping as a way of understanding whom you might surround yourself with, who might also be shaped in the image of values that reflect a caregiving experience, that help give voice to some of your experiences and values that you talked about?
Sure, absolutely. Care mapping was developed by a fellow in San Francisco whose name is Rajiv Mehta. He has a website called Atlas of Caregiving, and these images depict what a care map of what we would call a care ecosystem looks like. You can hand draw them, or on the Atlas of Caregiving website, there's a tool that's very user-friendly to create these maps of caring relationships online as well. Zachary, could you advance the slide? So there's the website if you'd like to go, and there is a tab that says Learn More about care mapping, and that's what you hit if you want all the instructions of how to make your own care map. And we have a chapter about this in the book. I find that it's a transformational tool to understand what is going on in your life with respect to all of your caring relationships and what is missing. So what's working well, but what may be missing that you hadn't really realized until you see a visual representation of all of the care relationships in your life. So a care map isn't going to explain the emotional side of your caregiving equation or tell you how to resolve your caregiving challenges, but what it will do is give you an objective lens through which to look, and what you see might surprise you. So very quickly, this is an example of a spousal caring relationship that was drawn using the tool that's on the website. We recommend that you use a pencil and paper to do a care map yourself. Put yourself in the center of a box-shaped house, and then put the person you're caring for with you there if you look after them at home. And along the bottom, if you can see, a thick line is the frequency of relationship, whether it's hourly, daily, weekly, or occasionally. So the very faint dotted lines are occasional, and the further on the image that somebody is drawn, that means they live far away. So care maps are easy to draw, and this is Ida, who was a registered nurse, though not currently practicing, looking after her husband, Ian, who is retired. And Ian has Lewy body dementia, and they have a variety of professionals and support groups in their lives and extended families. Next slide. So, oh, sorry, go back. Yeah, thanks. So these relationships indicate how often, where people are. Often the arrows would point both ways. So Ida may look after her husband Ian, but Ian may be looking after her as well. So we can see reciprocity. People put in their pets, friends, neighbors who may deliver food. It's incredible. There are a series of questions that you could ask yourself about these images when you have drawn your care map. You can ask yourself things like, who in this map is indispensable, and what happens if they're not there? You know, what happens if I get sick as a caregiver? Where's the backup plan? Is there anyone you've forgotten? It's amazing how people tend to forget the people closest to them when they draw a care map. How is communication and coordination managed among all these parties? And what do you not see on this map? What's missing? You can begin to flesh out your care map, and then you can share it with your caring professionals and your clinicians as well to help them better understand the reality of your caregiving life. The other, the other idea and framework that I wanted to share with you as a handy tool tonight is something called the F words. It was developed by researchers actually who work in the field of disability, but I'm going to share it with you tonight because I think it works really well for anyone in a caring relationship. So the F words are function, family, fitness, fun, friends, and future. And function, function can apply to whatever anybody does. How things are done is not what's important, but it could be a role, a job, a task. And in the case of spousal caregiving, it might mean rehabilitation, or it could be being a mother, being a father to our children. In family, that's the essential environment of everyone. We all live within family, however we define family. Fitness is about physical activity, exercising, and other recreational opportunities. Fun is however we choose to define that in our lives. Friends, and future is what personal development's all about. So it could be a plan or an aspiration for something we would like to do before we die, something we would like to do this afternoon or next week or in a month's time. These are domains that you can fill in for everybody in the family. So next slide. So you can Google CanChild F Words collage. Now this is an interactive tool that anyone can fill out. So where you see the apostrophe S there, you just fill in your name. So this is, this could be Donna's F Word collage. And I'm going to put photos, drop photos from my photo file into function, family, fitness, fun, friends, and future. And I may be the caregiver. So I have my own objectives for the F words, but the person I'm caring for will have his or her own as well. So then you can take these F word collages and compare them, talk about them. Well, if these are your objectives, how am I going to get my objectives in there too. Well, maybe we can use our weekly calendar to make sure we all get what we need. Someone, when I was speaking at a Parkinson's event, someone put up their hand and said, "Can you give me a framework for self-care?" And this is what I presented, because I think it works well for that purpose. And I think that's my last slide, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and Donna, in terms of what you're talking about with care mapping and the F words, tonight we've talked about how the caregiving experience can transform how you think about those closest to you, even though they have sincere well wishes for you. And we talked about this idea of intolerance, and not against people as individuals, but as caregivers, we must accept the values that are shaping us. Simply, we don't resist the idea that water shapes rocks in a river. They are shaped by their experiences, and so too are we. And sometimes our intolerances for others make it difficult for us to understand our own realities, as we are kind of torn between multiple realities. And that's why when doing a caregiving map, for example, in addition to the frameworks that you talked about, Donna, I think perhaps one other possibility could be, are there enough people around me who have, that I have a tolerance for their values and attitudes that are shaped by caregiver experiences? And I think that might be important as the beginning first step in thinking about developing a coherent and compelling way of making sense of your experiences that are meaningful to you in ways that your loved one may not be able to participate in, and your friends and family may not be able to understand. And so Donna and I tonight are grateful that you shared your hour with us, and obviously we could have gone into so much more detail. If you are a part of WellSpouse or want to become a part of this fantastic organization, there is their annual conference in Las Vegas, and I'm honored to be speaking at that conference, and that's the subject matter of how do you communicate difficult truths to those around you about your care situation and yourself. And as we've mentioned, many of the ideas that we talked about tonight are in our book, and this is just one transformation we talked about. You are the expert, but the goal of this book, The Unexpected Journey of Caring, is to provide you a way of understanding yourself and your experiences and your loved ones in ways that are meaningful to you and ways that work for you, by helping you realize that some of the conversations you have with yourself are not simply about you, but a part of a larger caregiver identity that binds us all. And so, Jerry, I don't know if there's a few questions that we could address in the few minutes we have remaining to respect people's time.
Yep, we have one so far. We don't have any questions right now. So if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to push the little hand button. And for the moment, Bob Mastro has his hand up, and I will unmute Bob's mic. Okay, Bob, your mic is now live. Go ahead, you can speak.
Well, first, as president of WellSpouse, I want to thank Zachary and Donna for this evening's presentation. I thought it was wonderful, and I want to encourage everyone who's listening to come to the conference in Las Vegas. And then besides that, I think Donna mentioned when we were talking about acceptance, Donna, you touched on a word which is really important for a lot of WellSpouses. You mentioned loss. It's really a loss when you're accepting. In that phase, you're accepting losses, and there are a lot of losses. The losses come fast and furious sometimes, depending on how fast your spouse's illness comes on. Loss of income, loss of an intimacy partner, the losses just mount. And we often talk about that in our group settings, and it's worth thinking about, and it's worth exploring a little more, these losses.
Yes, I mean, the idea of how loss and grief intersect in caregiving, there is, I mean, in the case of spousal caregiving, I watched my mother at home look after my father, who had 3 strokes and passed away. And then my stepfather, who had Parkinson's and passed away from that. And, you know, the loss is, I think, probably, well, I don't, maybe the hardest thing to cope with. It's very difficult to keep caring when what you want to do is fall to your knees in the face of so much loss and in the face of the incapacity to heal and to fix loss, to turn back time. And I think that this reminds us of our fragility as humans and our vulnerable human condition, and the fact that there are so many things that we cannot do in spite of our will, in spite of our love. And yet walking that path together, there is so much nobility and love in that. And also, I think, Zachary talked about comfort, and to give comfort is something. It's really something. And I think we need to think of these things as the weaponry that we have to battle the effects of these multiplying losses.
Bob, and to add to what Donna's saying, it's a profound question because, the loss oftentimes in a spousal relationship can be, as your members know so well, is invisible to outsiders. It's the intimacy that may be lost. It might be disclosure. It might be mutuality or reciprocity. It may be the idea of the usness that you once had in your mind that you must recraft while everyone else still sees you as married in a sense, but you almost have to reintroduce yourself every day or hourly to your spouse, who may not resemble in so many different ways the person that you married or the person or relationship you had in your mind. So I think it's such a great question, Bob, because those invisible losses are almost impossible to communicate when everyone around you says, well, you're still married. And for you, the notion of that.
I think we lost Zachary.
Are we there?
Yep,
Yes.
there you go.
We just lost you for a second, Zachary.
Okay. All right.
Well, again, if my mic is still on, I want to thank you once again. I know we're getting to the end of the hour, and I look forward to meeting you at the conference, Zachary. And Donna, I thank you very much for your book and for participating tonight.
It was
we do have one more question.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We do have a question from Connie Beardsley, so I'm going to mute your phone line, Bob, and I'm going to unmute Connie's. Okay, Connie, you can ask your question.
Okay, well, I'm trying to figure out how to unmute.
Yeah, you're not. Oh, you just muted yourself. Hold on a second. Don't. I can't unmute you. You need to unmute your phone. Connie, if you can hear me, you need to unmute it. I cannot unmute you.
Perhaps Connie could type her question into the chat box if she could see that.
That would be a good idea.
There's a little arrow beside the word chat on your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you click that arrow, a box will appear, and you can, where it says type message here,
In the meantime, Nancy has a question, so I'm going to unmute her.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy, you are self-muted. If you could unmute your phone, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Does the book, or I'd like to hear more about how a married person renegotiates that balance of power thing. Power is the wrong word, but my husband has been the sort of the lead in our marriage, and now I am, and he's it's just such an awkward inequality, and it's goes unspoken most of the time because, I mean, what are you going to do? But do you have any words for when those roles flip?
Yeah, I mean, Donna, you want me to take this? You want to take it? It's a great question.
Well, I'll start, Zachary, and then I know that you have important messages too. I have a chapter in our book about power in relationships, and you know, a lot of my thinking has been informed by a book called Love and Power, and in that book there are great drawings of these different kinds of conceptions of love and power, and love is portrayed by a single burning torch. Power is a single burning torch, and power is defined as the drive toward self-realization. So the drive toward being me. Love is portrayed in an image as a bonfire with lots of logs on the fire, and it's the drive toward mutuality and achieving through kind of consensus and the idea of being together. So when I think of the torch, I think of your husband. When I think of the bonfire, I think of you. And I think, you know, in lots of ways, we are gendered that way in our society and in our, you know, relationships. I do think, though, that when these issues play out in caring relationships and also with healthcare professionals too, by the way, the power and love get all turned upside down. But I guess the only thing I will say right now with the time that we have, because it's such a complicated question and it's a great question, is that if we realize kind of what's happening, that it does make it somewhat easier to be able to name it and talk about it. I could say that for now. Zachary?
Great response, Donna. I would only add that we talk about some possibilities for mindfulness about how you think about your role. And once some of those labels are removed, to be able to evaluate and provide feedback for yourself about how you're responding to the changing nature of your role, you're having to rewrite your role and your perception of what a wife or spouse should be on the fly. And it's very, very challenging. And yet they need to be rewritten in part so that you can begin to understand how you can be a good spouse in the particular nature of your relationship. And that takes time and effort, but also a type of mindfulness and an outsourcing to a group like a Well Spouse, in which people might be further along in that path, and strategies that they may have employed, ways that they may have rethought their experiences, and tools that they may have used. They are your greatest resource, because it is something that is necessary to your own well-being in your relationship. And it's an ongoing kind of rewriting of the script that you had planned out in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.
Okay, so we did have one question from Connie. She asked a question via the chat line.
Okay.
The question had to do with loss of intimacy.
Jerry, we're having trouble hearing you.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was having a little bit of trouble. I was speaking into a handset that wasn't live. Sorry about that. All right, so I did have one question that Connie had asked, and it has to do with the loss of intimacy. So I don't know how you guys would answer something
Can you
like
read
that.
the question? Can you read the question?
Yeah, it just says
Or
it had
just-
to do
okay,
with
okay.
loss of intimacy, and that was it. That's all she wrote.
Yeah.
Zachary?
I'll just start, and Donna, I'd like you to add, you know, in interviewing caregivers and spousal relationships, this is a theme that comes up repeatedly and with deep challenge, in that the threats to your intimate relationship are abound when you're a caregiver. And in the book, we talk about stories of the idea of simply bathing your spouse can be a challenge and a threat to your intimate experiences as a spouse, because some people don't want to see themselves in the role of a nurse, or see themselves like bathing. A spouse might be that of a nurse, and that takes away their ability to see their spouse as in an intimate fashion. And so some have felt that that's off limits, and so using care mapping, they might outsource that component because it's so important for them to see intimacy as an ongoing experience in whatever way that works for them. And for some spouses, that's bathing a spouse is not an interference on seeing one spouse as an intimate partner. But I would challenge, I think care mapping might be helpful in terms of thinking about those aspects of your caregiving role that may be crowding out your ability to see yourself as an intimate partner with your loved one. Donna, you want to add anything?
Yeah, you know, when Christopher Reeve had his accident, I remember his wife saying she did not want to be his nurse. She wanted to be his wife. And I remember thinking then, wow, that is privilege. That is privilege with a capital P. Good for her. I mean, I couldn't have been more happy for her because she seemed like a very nice person. But who has the funds, realistically, who could simply state that and not be in a position where you have to negotiate power, you have to negotiate the loss of intimacy because there is no one else to give the care that someone needs in order to survive. And so I think what most of us have to do, anyone in sort of the real world of spousal caregiving, is to look in dark corners for opportunities for intimacy that you never would have conceived of before you needed to seek them out. Intimacy is going to look very different when you are bathing someone, when you are caring for someone who is incontinent. These caring tasks that would seem to be polar opposites of intimacy are going to force you, I think, to look for different ways of touching, different ways of breathing in a synchronized fashion. You know, really, I think that these challenging situations force us to be creative in order to find our shared humanity, our intimacy that is, again, just simply going to be very, very different from what we ever thought it would be, and from what others might, you know, think that intimacy should be between married people.
Such a great point, Donna, about the idea of intimacy is inevitably connected to meaning. And if it's possible for your spouse to participate in the construction of what might be intimate, you know, rewriting what is intimate, as Donna is talking about, can be intimate unto itself. If your spouse is incapable of that, it's much more challenging, but there is the reclaiming of a we component that is so necessary to intimacy is as Donna says, not what others might find intimate, but what you and your partner craft together that has a type of meaning and resonance given the particulars of the situation. And but a real question, an absolutely real legitimate question. I'm so glad that you brought it up.
Yeah.
She also commented that her husband is in end-stage kidney failure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, so Bob has another question, so I unmuted his phone and I'm muting Nancy's again. So go ahead, Bob.
Well, I see that I want to thank everyone for staying on beyond the hour. And I just wanted to encourage everyone to go to www.wellspouse.org, and you will see the book, The Unexpected Journey of Caregiving, right on the home page of the website, and you'll see a description of the program that you could expect to see at the conference, and you can see all kinds of good information there. So I want to encourage everyone to go to the website, and I believe we have a link there where you can actually purchase the book. Okay? Once again, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to say thank you again for all you've done for us, Zachary and Donna. Thank you.
It is a pleasure.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, we can end the webinar.
Thanks so much, Jerry. Appreciate it, and all of the participants. Thank you so much.